A newly released poll from the Des Moines Register shows Senator Bernie Sanders leading a tight race in Iowa. The poll, released Friday, shows Sanders in first at 20%. He's trailed closely by Senator Elizabeth Warren, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, and former Vice President Joe Biden. That same poll also found 57% of likely Democratic caucus goers saying foreign policy issues are extremely important to them. Ed O'Keefe reports on how candidates are addressing the topic with less than a month until the first-in-the-nation caucuses.
As soon as she took the stage in Dover, New Hampshire today, Elizabeth Warren was confronted by a protester.
You're siding with ISIS! You're siding with Iran! Why are you siding with terrorists?
Speaking to reporters after, Warren questioned the president's timing.
He has a problem with his impending impeachment and his use of foreign policy as a way to try to promote his own personal political agenda.
Bernie Sanders also raised doubts about Mr. Trump's judgment.
We have a president who is a pathological liar.
And Joe Biden is trying to use unrest in the Middle East to his advantage. He's airing a new ad in Iowa that touts his decades of work on foreign affairs.
We need someone tested and trusted.
If any of them become the Democratic nominee, they could get financial help from a current rival. Michael Bloomberg has vowed to keep spending millions of his own money, even if he loses the nomination to defeat President Trump.
And our campaign is going to stay here until November to help elect Democrats up and down the ballot.
As the campaign rolls along, there's another big debate next Tuesday in Iowa, and just 6 of the remaining 13 candidates have qualified. Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer. The multi-billionaire businessman from California made it just under the wire thanks to some surveys in South Carolina and Nevada that gave him the numbers he needed. He has spent from his vast fortune on TV ads all across the country. Tanya?
Ed O'Keefe in Washington, thank you so much. For more on this, let's bring in Isaac Wright and Leslie Sanchez. Isaac is a Democratic strategist and partner at Forward Solutions Strategy Group. He's in Nashville. And Leslie is a CBS News political contributor and Republican strategist. She's in Washington. Welcome to both of you. Isaac, let me start with you. Since dropping out over a week ago, Julian Castro has endorsed Senator Elizabeth Warren and appeared at campaign events with her. So what does he bring to Warren's campaign?
So the Democratic nomination process is proportional in our primaries and caucus. So what he brings is his base of support, number one, which is important in winning delegates for the actual process of nominating the president. But also it has to do with building a platform to continue his own agenda, right? And that's where you see the opportunity for a lot of, if you will, the candidates who might be called also ran. Those who also ran for president but didn't really compete all the way in the nominating process. They all have the opportunity to move forth and use the power of their endorsement to continue to further their platform and their agenda. And that's a positive part of the Democratic process, a positive part of the nomination process.
Sure. Now they have some national standing. All right. So, Leslie, what impact does Castro's endorsement of Warren and the shrinking Democratic field have on Republicans?
I think probably one of the most interesting things related to this is, in addition to Castro being somebody who ran for president, he's also somebody who is going to help benefit Latino voters for Elizabeth Warren. At least that would seem to be their political calculation. If you think about the fact that Bernie Sanders has this tremendous support among Latino voters, and Castro, being the former mayor of San Antonio, one of the most Hispanic, certainly, populations in the state of Texas, he's going to bring a base, even though it's not a natural fit for him. He's somebody who's inherently Latino. It's value added. It doesn't say that he runs as the Latino candidate. But Warren has been missing these types of constituencies she's going to need in those early primaries. If Biden is doing so well with African American, Bernie's doing so well with Latino, and somebody like Elizabeth Warren has, in some polls, as low as 5% in a state like California, she definitely needs diversity among her leadership.
For sure. And Isaac, I want to ask you about Tuesday's Democratic debate. 6 candidates have qualified for the debate stage in Des Moines, Iowa. Notably absent, though, from the stage this time around is Andrew Yang. And Senator Cory Booker is missing his 2nd debate in a row. So what are the consequences of not being on the debate stage for candidates who were hoping for a strong showing in the Iowa caucuses?
Well, it makes Iowa all or nothing, make it or break it, I think, for Booker potentially. And that said, I think you can see that if you trace his campaign, he's been spending so much time lately in Iowa and making the appeal to Iowa caucus goers directly that even though he's not going to be on stage, asking for their support in the caucus. So I think that makes it make or break the outcome of the caucus for his candidacy, perhaps even for Yang's. In addition to that, I think you can look for the debate for a couple of folks, Steyer and Klobuchar for sure, who are going to be looking for a breakout moment. They're going to be the two candidates out of the six on stage who are polling under like 5%. So for those two, they're going to make it on stage, but the debate itself maybe make it or break it for their campaigns, and you're going to see Steyer and Klobuchar looking for a breakout moment.
Mm-hmm. All right, Isaac, though, sticking with Iowa for a moment, our latest CBS News Battleground Tracker poll shows Senator Sanders in a tie for first place in Iowa with Mayor Pete Buttigieg and former Vice President Bernie Sanders. Could a strong performance in Tuesday's debate be enough to give any of them a last-minute bump before the caucuses?
That is an unknown question, a variable everybody's going to be watching the debate and eventually the caucus to see. The Iowa caucus works a little bit differently. Your second choice matters because as people winnow down who makes and doesn't make the cutoff point, caucus goers are moved to their second choice. So it's still anybody's ball game. Yes, we see a lot of momentum behind Buttigieg. Sanders' campaign, which had been sort of falling behind, seems to be gaining maybe a little steam, but it's still anybody's ball game going into the caucus.
And Leslie, I want to switch topics now to the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign has been touting the death of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. They've purchased ads on Facebook with that messaging and say he's no longer a threat to the United States. How are campaign officials using this or trying to use this to their advantage?
Well, there certainly is this idea of America first and protecting America and our homeland. And this is something that collectively should be bringing people together. And I think as the Democrats have calculated to, in some cases, gone so extremist to sound like apologists for the president's strong divisive action, I think the president's campaign has seen this as an opportunity, again, to show how different and how progressively left the Democratic Party has become. At a time when a previous administration, you would think that Republicans and Democrats would come together in agreement that this is a positive. You're not seeing that. And because of that, as the president does, he's going to continue to lean into it.
And Isaac, we know a lot of 2020 candidates have been focusing on Iran and foreign policy now that it's in the spotlight. Is this something, though, that resonates with voters? It tends to be kind of down on the list when it comes to what voters in primaries are most concerned with.
Foreign policy often isn't the top issue, but I think when we're talking about the scenario of committing troops for the long term to a war in the Middle East again, I think people are going to start paying attention and taking the issue very seriously. I think where you can expect to see Democratic candidates criticizing Trump is the fact that there is no strategy behind this. We just assassinated one of the leadership members of a foreign nation, and there's no larger strategy. He was a bad guy. He was a terrorist and a danger. But it doesn't change the fact there's not a larger strategy for how to deal with Iran. And that's going back to the time when we pulled out of the agreement that kept them from producing nuclear weapons. Now we've pulled out of an agreement that prevents Iran from producing nuclear weapons, and we've escalated the tensions with them. Are we nearly at the brink of war? I think people are going to take that very seriously this election season. I think they're going to be taking it very seriously in the coming days and weeks.
So, Leslie, I'm curious, does the Trump campaign see all of this Iran news as a welcome respite from the news cycle around the impeachment?
I think strategically some of them probably do. This tends to be one of those issues that America comes together. They look to defend American interests first, and the party politics stops at the border. Unfortunately, we're in such a climate that that's not the case. When it's not the case, you go to other variables. Who's in the best position to make those leadership decisions? Is the exercise, and this is the hard part. The Democrats refuse to give any credence to some of the positive actions the president's made. You didn't see anything about the fact that he's been paid. We're moving forward now with diplomatic efforts. It's a de-escalation of what was a very tense week. We're not hearing anything about that. Instead, we're talking about strategy. And I will say, to be fair, Republicans said the same thing with Barack Obama when he was taking strong military action, that there wasn't a strategy behind it. This is part and parcel of what a president has to do.
Right.
And it's not so extreme that that the Democrats, I believe, have a legitimate leg to stand on.
All right, so let's end our little chat with the same question we always end our Friday politics chat with. Who had a good week and who had a bad week as you look at the 2020 field? Leslie, let's start with you.
Sure. Let's start with bad week. On the bad week, I would say Nancy Pelosi had a really bad week. She's come to terms with the reality that impeachment is not going anywhere. She sat on her hands, despite making an argument in the House that this was such an urgent matter that the Congress had to address. But when it was not on her terms, when it was not going to be biased in the same way that they adjudicated this in the House, it kind of lost momentum. So that argument is going to have a really hard time when it goes to the Senate. Also, Marianne Williamson, she's somebody who dropped out of the presidential bid this week. She brought a very different, eclectic type of approach to campaigning. But I do think there's positives for her. She talked about education and ideas in advancing education reform in a very cogent ways, and she kind of lifted and gave some levity, spiritually, you could say, to those debate stages. And I think it's a positive overall, especially for all of us who are looking for new and different ideas.
Right, absolutely. And so who had a good week?
President Trump had a good week, and it's a political win. And it's a significant win. It's not going to be the biggest one. We won't know historically for a long time where this falls. But the fact that impeachment is losing momentum, Republican senators are coming back under the fold, you're not going to see this mass exodus of Republican senators who are, as we lean into moving into the Senate effort and the trial. We still don't know what could happen. Anything could happen, but you're not seeing abandonment of the president on one side. And on the issue with dealing with Iran and de-escalating this issue, it's just kind of at a pause right now. And that isn't something people expected, at least earlier in the week. So the president is leading on this issue. He's doing well, and he's also riding on a strong economy. This has been, there are not very many of them, but this has been a good week for the president.
All right, Isaac, I'm going to turn to you, but I just want to say I want to piggyback on what you said about Marianne Williamson. And, I am going to miss her sort of unique voice, right? There's nobody like her on the political stage right now. All right.
It did add some levity.
That's right. That's some levity. So, yes. Isaac, what about you? Who had a really good week and who had a not so good week?
Well, let's start off with the good week. I think the good week this week was barely noticed in the national news, but it was a big deal in California. Governor Gavin Newsom produced a plan that he said he's going to have more details coming out for the state of California to go into the generic prescription drug business. At a time when Republicans in the U.S. Senate and the Trump administration have failed to deliver any plausible, any noticeable difference on the prescription drug price crisis in America, a governor is taking the lead, and regardless of how well the program works, there's a good chance he's going to break the logjam in Washington. He's going to force the Republican stranglehold in Washington, influenced by prescription drug lobbyists, to move and to do something about this crisis, and maybe even create a model for how we can better address the prescription drug crisis in America. And the other big winners in this are Californians, who hopefully are going to be paying less for their necessary prescription drugs going forward. I think that's a major big positive for the week.
Something a lot of people would like to see. All right, so who had a bad week, Isaac?
The bad week this week has to go to Mitch McConnell. He has previously said he has no intention of having an impartial trial. Senators like Lindsey Graham have followed him in saying that. And this week he announced, in fact, that he had the Republican votes to ensure that there's not an impartial trial, that there can be no witnesses called and no documents produced. That's a mockery of justice, and it's a mockery of the Constitution. But here's the most compelling part. As we have been reminded, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court is going to stand before the Senate and ask them to raise their right hand and swear them in as impartial jurors. That means Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and the likes of them in the Republican caucus are going to have to stand there on the Senate floor and lie in an oath before the American people and lie in an oath before God, or excuse themselves from the process. It's a mockery of justice. It's a mockery of the American system, and Republicans are going to be remembered for it in the history books.
All right, Isaac Wright and Leslie Sanchez, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.